Hi, my name is David Gibson, and I'm director of the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University, the Jesuit University of New York. Now, one of the great things about heading something called the Center on Religion and Culture is that it reminds us just how much religion and culture are intertwined, not just in the past, but today as well. And the conversation you're about to see between Pete Docter of Pixar and Father Jim Martin of the Society of Jesus is a perfect example of that. The conversation really came about because I was reading a story in National Catholic Reporter on Pixar's latest movie, Soul. Soul came out at Christmas time, and it tells the story of a middle school music teacher, Joe Gardner, who desires nothing more than to make it as a professional jazz pianist. No spoilers, but just as Joe gains his dream, he loses his life. And the film is an exploration of the afterlife, and the pre-life, and the meaning of life. Lots of big ideas, great animation, wonderful music, and it's funny. In her article, NCR's movie reviewer, the wonderful Sister Rose Pacat, noted that Pete Docter, the movie's co-writer and director and creative chief at Pixar, had been inspired to write this film by reading Father Jim Martin's 2010 book, The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything. Now, I know that book, and I know Father Jim Martin, and I know Pete Docter is a Midwestern Lutheran turned Presbyterian who's been open about his Christian faith and interests. So I say to myself, what if we got the Jesuit priest and this Protestant studio exec in the same Zoom room for a chat? The result is a wonderful discussion about God and Jesus, vocation and purpose, feeling fulfilled versus being successful. Walter Brueggemann and Anthony DeMello, Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock also make cameos. Enjoy.
A real intro. I want to introduce Pete Docter, who's an animator, film director, screenwriter, producer, voice actor, and chief creative officer of Pixar. He's best known for directing the Pixar animated feature films Monster Inc., which I loved, Up, which I adored, Inside Out, which I loved, and Soul, which I just saw and loved. He has described himself as a, quote, geeky kid from Minnesota who likes to draw cartoons. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Where are you, by the way?
I am in California, the
Okay, that
East
makes
Bay of
sense.
California. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the studio's closed, so we can't go to work. So we're doing everything from home.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's, individual homes, which is weird, but it's working. So
Well, I'm sure a lot of stuff is on the computer anyway, right? I
yeah,
assume.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I loved Soul. I thought it was
Oh, thank you.
beautiful. Yeah. Congratulations too.
Thanks. Well,
Um,
as we talked about, I mean, your work was influential. I grew up Lutheran and then converted to Presbyterianism by marriage. So I've
wow.
been in the Protestant end of things. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of this was very new to me. And being in Protestants, there's a lot of talk about the weird Catholic stuff
Mm-hmm.
like the saint worship and
Mm-hmm.
transubstantiation and things. So it was great to just see how accessible and inspiring and useful the ideas in your book and were just really I particularly formative for me were finding God in all things, which
Hmm.
I don't know if that communicates in the
Oh
film.
yeah. Especially the last, I don't want to like spoiler alert. Like the last scene, the last few minutes to me, I don't know if this is what you intended. You're the filmmaker, but that was very much finding God in all things. I thought that was so beautiful.
Yeah, I mean it. I guess my journey in making the film was, I'm blessed to be given this passion for animation, which I've loved since I was 8.
Mm,
And I grew up doing it just for fun in my bedroom. I
mm-hmm,
started professionally when I was 15. And so I've been working at this.
mm,
And I guess somewhere in the back of my head was this idea that I have to earn my way to being loved, that someday if I do a good enough job, my life will be complete and I'll be like, everything's, and of course that doesn't happen. And so that of course is the key. One of the key scenes in the film is our main character. His journey is to be a jazz musician. And after years of struggle, he finally gets it. And he has a great concert. but he's still the same guy
Mm,
at the end. And so, that idea of seeking freedom and detachment, I think, was also very pivotal in
mm,
that.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and but it sounds like you have your own vocation, right? As a cartoonist and filmmaker. You said you've enjoyed doing that since you were 8. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. There's always the kid in your class who they can draw everything,
Mm-hmm.
dinosaurs and horses. And that was not me. I wanted to be that guy, or gal, but I ended up doing flip books in the corners of my
Oh
math
wow.
book. And it was
Yeah.
movement that really inspired
Mm.
me.
So how'd you get into how did Soul come about? I mean, it's pretty deep. Did you is it was and was that I was curious, was that hard to pitch? Or are you or are you the pitchy?
Well, I am now, but
Yeah.
at the time, I did pitch it, and I kind of pitched it with, I've always wondered, where do we? Well, I'll start by saying I have 2 kids who are young adults now, but you look back, and I think most people say this about their kids. They're like, that kid had a personality from the moment they were born. They came into the world with a sense of who they were. Where did that come from? And so really just exploring the idea of some sort of pre-life,
Mm,
a place where our souls were trained and formed,
mm-hmm.
which might help explain why my sister is more cautious than I am, or even though we have the same genetic structure, worked in the grew up in the same place.
Mm-hmm.
So just looking for, and what one of the another great gift of working on this film was getting to do a lot of research, not only into Christian religions, but every major religion we could find an expert on. We would ask them about how does your tradition look at the soul? What is it? What does it look like? What is it? How does it work? And where does it come from? Where does it go? All those kind of things. One of the things we found early on was not many traditions have much to say about before birth.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of contradictory things of like, when is ensoulment, and you get into all sorts of prickly areas there.
Yeah.
But where it comes from and
Mm.
what was there before, I guess we found that the Mormon belief has quite a kind of a story built around that, but not very many other traditions.
What's your belief? Do you believe that soul and vocation are united? I mean, in the way you talk about in the film, do you think everybody has a vocation?
Well, I feel like those are gifts, right? That
Mm,
that you get, but it's not the same as purpose.
mm,
I feel like you're given a sense of something that you're really good at and that you're passionate for. But I think the mistake that a lot of us make who have those is that then that somehow becomes like self-defining,
yeah.
or that there's something to be achieved or
Yeah.
something. So the message of the film is really trying to tease those apart, to say,
Mm,
hey, there's nothing wrong with you know wanting to be a jazz musician or a
mm,
cartoonist or whatever,
mm-hmm.
but that doesn't have to be the totality of who you are and in the world.
Yeah, my novice director I may have mentioned this in the book. My novice director used to say, "You're a human being, not a human doing." So it's not about producing, right? It's not
uh,
about. And I want to get back to you said something you said a lot of interesting things at the beginning about the sort of desire to be loved. Um, how do you think? Do you think it's a sense that we feel like we have to produce or do things in order to get people to love us? Do you think that is that what you're trying to sort of
yeah,
express in
and
the
I mean,
film
I
too?
think the church has struggled with that back and forth with faith, works, and is
Yeah.
it just good enough to believe and then that's it, or do you have to
Mm-hmm.
do certain things? And
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of us, especially, I don't know if this is culturally true, but I'll speak, in America, it does seem like there is this relentless pursuit of stuff,
Yeah.
of success. And so to kind of unconsciously learn that your own worth might be tied to your accomplishments, I can see how that happens. And
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's,
and I mean, if you are what you do, and certainly at the, if that's taken away from you, or at the end of your life you don't have an active profession, then you feel like you're nothing. And I think that's what's so hard for some people, especially if they're unemployed or they feel like they're not sort of successful in the eyes of the world. They don't feel like they're valuable. you know?
Yeah, we talked a lot at the beginning of this film. Again, we're working at Pixar. I'm surrounded by people like me who found this when they were young, and
Hmm.
they love it. But a lot of us have siblings, and this guy I was working with said, "My sister, she's a stay-at-home mom, and she looks at me, and we've had a couple of conversations where she's just like, you have this wonderful
Mm,
gift in cartooning, and I don't feel like I
yeah.
have that. I'm missing something. And so in making the film, we were really striving to speak to both sides of it, the sort of the glory and pitfalls of
Yeah.
having that, and then the sort of sadness of not.
Yeah, and who's to say who has the? I mean, even if you could have like a contest, the more valuable life, the cartoonist or the mom, right? I
Yeah,
mean, who's doing something that's quote unquote better, right? I thought that one of the things I really liked was the emphasis on your main character's role as a teacher too,
mm,
which is the less glamorous side. But you see how he has that interaction with the young girl that comes up and knocks on his door and plays the trombone. I think it's just as valuable as anything else he's doing in the jazz world. You know,
absolutely.
so I think it's a nice reminder of everyone's having a vocation.
Yeah,
I have to
I was
go
just going to
ahead.
say my parents are both music teachers,
Mm.
and they had a little Von Trapp family thing going with my sisters are musicians, and I played for a long time, and so we would always be trotted out on Easter and things to play, which in Minnesota where I grew up was freezing cold on Easter morning. You go to the sunrise
Wow.
service, and your
Yeah.
fingers playing the violin are barely
Mhm.
able to move, but I did seeing them, see the real value of instruction and being a mentor.
No, it's beautiful. That really comes across. Now, take me through. I'm just curious. Like, how does the idea come for a movie like this? I mean, I just, I mean, I'm obviously not a cartoonist. I write and things like that. But how does you? I mean, it's such an unusual idea.
I'll bet it's similar in like almost any work. When you see it finished, you think, "Oh, this must have just like your book just like came down
Mm-hmm.
and it
Mm-hmm.
appeared to you and you wrote it
Mm-hmm.
from page 1 to
The little,
page
like the
4."
Holy Spirit on my shoulder. Yeah.
Yeah. But of
Mm-hmm.
course, and I'm guessing that your experience is like mine, where you outline it, and you take things out, and you move things
Mm-hmm.
around, and the film process is the same. I started in this case with that observation of my kids having a sense of personality,
Mm-hmm.
as well as my own struggle at the time of, I guess you'd call like a midlife crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Who am I, and am I focusing my time? It's things you ask in the book, like,
Mm-hmm.
what am I supposed to do in life? How do
Mm-hmm.
I know who I'm supposed to be? Those are the questions that I was asking myself, and I think you can see that pretty centrally in the film. But a lot of it then is just exploring, like, what's the best way to put that across.
Mm. Oh, that's
What's the
interesting. Mm-hmm.
we the first version of the story took place entirely in the pre-life, which seemed poignant and interesting. But then the more we talked about the purpose of life, we recognized you got to go down to life. You got to live,
Mm-hmm.
um, and specifically the answer that we came to, which is that life is there available to you. It's not like you have to earn your way in,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so the story developed kind of around some of these realizations.
That's interesting. I'm curious. You said you had if it's not too personal, you had a midlife crisis, but you were working as a cartoonist, right? And at Pixar, was it kind of unhappiness with the job, or if it's not too personal?
No, I think it was basically after Inside Out. So,
Mm-hmm.
I had done Monsters Up, Inside Out, and that was, I mean, this is going to sound like I'm bragging, but it was a huge success
Yeah,
financially. We
sure.
got great reviews. We
Mm-hmm.
got an, Oscar,
Mm-hmm.
and yet I still felt like I was expecting somehow that to
Yeah.
fix me and to
Yeah.
put everything right.
Yeah.
And so it was unsettling when that didn't happen.
Mm.
Um, so that's kind of what where my soul was, I guess. It's kind of very unsettled,
It's a
even though I
lesson.
knew better.
Yeah, no, right. I mean, you can say that this shouldn't, but there is that expectation. I remember when my first book was published. I remember this vividly. It was sitting on my desk, and I always thought, "Oh my gosh, when I entered the Jesuits, I met someone who wrote a book. The first Jesuit I met, he wrote a book. I thought I've never met anyone who's written a book, right? It
Mm.
just seemed like the kind of sine qua non of kind of accomplishment. And I had my book out and it was sitting on my desk, and I remember thinking, okay, like that doesn't really do it. I mean, I still have my same problems and struggles and challenges, and it's really, it was kind of an aha moment for me. And I thought, this is, this is just, these kind of material things are not going to be satisfying. So
Yeah. And it feels like, some of these things come down to these what feel like cliches, like it's the journey, not the is the reward. And you're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. But it kind of is, right? If you're not enjoying what you're doing right now, it's not going to suddenly come as a big reward at the end when you're done.
yeah, it's not going to fix you. And I've had a lot of people who've come to me in spiritual direction. They'll talk about feeling not enough, right?
Mhm.
And when can I kind of accomplish something? And including, really successful people who just don't feel and a lot of that's sort of family of origin, but a lot of it's the spirituality too that we have to produce in order to make God love us. That's the other thing, right? We have to force God to love us by
Yeah.
being worthy. And yeah, that's why I thought the movie, I mean, there's an image for me. I'm just curious. I wonder what it means to you. I don't even know what it's called. The little seed, the little oak seed that
Mm.
comes down. For me, as a viewer, it was an image of kind of finding God in the smallest things. Is there a deeper meaning that means to you, or you know what I mean?
That's pretty deep. That's what it meant to me too.
Okay, all
Is
right,
that the things, what we were really trying to say. There's a scene towards the end of Act Two where Joe has played the concert of his life, and he's still the same guy. And he
yeah,
goes home and he takes this bunch of junk out of his pocket, and then he recognizes, wait, and he replaces the music, which to me
mm,
is like his plan, what he thought his plan for his life should be. And instead, now these pieces of junk, and he plays that, and so these things that he
mm,
passed by as being ordinary, as not worthy of his attention, are really what the great rewards of life,
mhm.
all around you every day. um,
Yeah, I mean that's the whole idea of the examination of conscience, which you look at the regular day to day things, and I think we tend to think, oh, the experience of God has to be, the great, God coming down to us in some big cloud or rainbow, and
which would be great. I'm not going to
which would
say
be
no.
nice. No, I would like that too. Sometimes I like a little more clarity. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's usually just the simple things. And for me, I mean, as a Christian, and I'm sure for you, God comes to us in the ordinary in Jesus. I mean, he's this guy, carpenter, and the people in Nazareth can't believe it. It's like, who, him? Like what, that's impossible. That can't be God. And
Yeah.
he talks to them in parables and talks about seeds and birds, and it's shocking because we
Yeah.
do have this idea that has to be bigger and greater.
I think the other thing that, working on this film, and I've been in a weekly Bible study for years,
Hmm.
the more I read the Bible and the more I understand, the less I understand, the less I think that I knew, as if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Things that seemed like, oh, this is a cut and dry parable, and you read it and you're like, wait, no, it's not. It's so confusing. What are they actually saying here?
Hmm.
I think there isn't this. Uh, as a young guy, I was looking at the Bible for answers. Like, I
Yeah.
want concrete, black and white, yes or no, what's correct, what's wrong. And really, what you get instead are a lot more questions and opportunity to kind of think for yourself and wake up and broaden your horizons a bit.
Well, which is what the disciples had a trouble with, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they even had to say to Jesus, "What does this mean?" A lot of scripture scholars say that those are later additions, that Jesus wasn't really explaining it to them. But even the people in like the communities of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they you can't just have that not explained. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
And even when they're explained, I think they're challenging for
Yeah.
people.
What is it? Do you know Walter Brueggemann?
Oh yeah, mm-hmm.
Listened to a couple interviews with him. He's a fascinating guy. And he said, you ask rabbis to explain a story, and they just tell you another story.
Yeah.
And you ask them to explain that story, and there's another story. So there's never
Mhm.
like a this equals this. That's something that you kind of have to figure out yourself, which makes sense to me. As I get older, I feel like there aren't concrete answers like that out in the world, and everything is, I don't know. Yeah. Anyway.
And I think that's why Jesus teaches in stories, right? Like
Hmm.
when someone says, "What's the reign of God?" He doesn't say, "Here's a PowerPoint presentation about the reign of God. Here are the 10 things that make up the reign of God." He's like, "I'm going to tell you a story about a seed, right? A mustard seed." Or "Who's my neighbor?" It's not, "Here are the 5 things that make up a neighbor." It's not, "Let me tell you about the Good Samaritan," right? So, and you're doing the same thing. I think, I mean, it's so much more. It opened. I think Walter Brueggemann said that arguments close our mind down, right, and
Mm.
stories open it up.
Mm.
And the difference between someone looking at soul and really thinking, right, like especially about the ending, like what does that mean, versus you writing a paper on why, like the importance of the soul and a vocation. Yeah.
It's funny, when in doing interviews like this, sometimes we'll get to like people asking me, what do you hope people take away from the film?" And I'm like, well, if I could tell you that, I wouldn't have had to make the film. It's
That's right.
something
You just like a tweet. Well,
it's
that.
something about story that I do
Yeah.
think stories are fundamentally how we communicate. If I stand here and give you a long laundry list of facts and figures,
Hmm.
you kind of like doze off. But if I lean forward and go, all right, there's this guy I know who's got a big problem. Suddenly you're like, what? Really? So
Exactly.
it's just human nature.
Well, the other thing is like Pope Francis talks a lot about the culture of encounter, right? In terms of different peoples and different populations. And a lot of that is just understanding people's stories. So there's one
Mm,
thing to learn about a refugee or like see all these, like 65 million refugees. It's another thing to meet a person and hear their story. Like
yeah,
this is what happened to me. And I
yeah.
think that's where the conversion comes, right? And I think that's what Jesus knew. But I also think that's why stories are so subversive in a good way, right? And
Yeah.
dangerous.
Well, it's also one of the great gifts of being an animator is, you
Mm,
can step into other people's shoes. You have this, as an animator, I can be a giant monster. I can be a little pencil. I can be a
mm,
teapot. I can be anything, and this film, having to do with an African American, really was eye opening to me. And not that I even pretend to know half of what that's like, but to listen to stories, to be working with people who, were able to kind of open that side of things up. I think, I have at very least a deeper understanding than I did 4 years ago of that whole journey that those people are going through.
hmm By the way, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
Oh
you.
no, go for it.
I have to ask you. I mean, I was glad to see it in the movie because I read the interview with you and NCR and talked about the Ignatian spirituality. I love the fish story.
Oh,
That's one of my favorite, and
yeah,
obviously you do too.
yeah,
I just, what I thought was so charming. I mean, someone said, "Oh, the fish story, the Anthony DeMello story that you
yeah.
mentioned in your book is in there," and I thought, well, I wonder how they're going to do it. I mean, and I love that the woman just tells it. It's not animated in a sense. She just tells it, which I thought would have been the way that Anthony DeMello had told the story.
Oh, that's
So I'm
cool.
curious. Well, what does that story mean to you in your own life? The fish in the ocean, and like
Well,
in Pete Docter's life.
the I'll come back to that. I was just
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
say the original line we had, because we were finding that a lot of folks, especially younger people, were confused by this idea that Joe would play his big concert and not feel fulfilled. They were like, "What? That doesn't make any sense. He would be on cloud nine for days and
That's
so on." And
the
like,
young people would feel that,
yeah, it
but probably
was
not the older people. They'd
so we
get it.
wanted to, obviously the film has to speak to everybody. So we were
Mm,
looking for some way to underline that. And so, really inspired by, Miles Davis,
mm.
who was this enigmatic, he could be speaking riddles. We got to work with, Herbie Hancock for a
Oh
little while.
wow.
And he said, I was having a trouble playing once, and he knew that, Herbie, sorry, Miles knew that Herbie was struggling, and he leaned over and says, "Don't play the butter notes." And Herbie's like, "What does he mean? The butter is that like not fifths or thirds? And so without explaining what it meant, it meant that Herbie had to struggle. He eventually came to a whole new way of playing as a result of this enigmatic
Yes,
non-answer.
Jerry. That's
you
right.
know. And so we were gunning for that kind of thing. And our
Mm.
first try at it was when Joe says to Dorothea, the band leader,
Hmm.
I feel like I was thinking things would be different. She just looked at him and she said, you know, I had the best cup of coffee today. Mm-mm-mm. And then she went off. And we're like, okay, that kind of does it. But some people were reading it a little bit more dismissive, like she
Dismissive.
was
Yeah.
ignoring it.
Yeah.
So when I hit this in your book, that story, it moved me to tears. And we
Oh.
recorded a version of it where she goes all the way to the end and says, "Stop searching, little fish," you know.
Mm.
Um, but we said, well, that's the punchline of the movie. We can't get there yet. So I stripped out the punchline, and then she just kind of lays that same enigmatic idea, which then plants a seed for Joe to be like, what is she talking about?
I like that much more than the coffee. The
Yeah.
coffee would have been, that's a little too zen, you know? Do you know have you done much reading in Anthony DeMello, the guy where that story comes from?
Not a lot. I have there's the one book that's a bunch of stories.
Yeah.
But
The, the,
no, yeah. What do you
the
recommend?
other one I love is, do you know the Salt Doll? Do you know that that parable?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
He
that's the other
wants to
one.
see the ocean and
And he steps in. He's a little doll made of salt, and he's looking for himself, and he wants to find the ocean. And then he steps in the ocean and dissolves, and says, "It's very moving to me. Now I know who I am."
yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
a lot of theologians don't like that because it sort of erases individuality. Speaking of which, and before we wrap up, I know you're busy. What's been I'm just kind of curious. I loved it. I'm only one person. What's been the kind of reaction from, shall we say, religious leaders and theologians and all that?
Generally, I haven't sought wide and deep reactions, but generally very positive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I spoke with Mark Laverton, who's the head of Fuller Theological Seminary. He put it, he said, cosmologically, it's not very Christian, this movie, but theologically and philosophically, he found it to be very Christian, which was comforting and also very puzzling because I spoke with some folks who live in Asia who said they found that the ideas that we put forward were very Buddhist,
Mm-hmm.
very Eastern.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then I spoke with a rabbi who actually consulted with on the film, and he said, "Oh, it's very Jewish." So
Isn't that
it
interesting?
either we're so vague that we appeal to everybody, or we found something kind of deeper that are at the core of these things.
Well, I would say anytime someone starts a sentence off with cosmologically, comma, you know that it's not going to live up to whatever expectation they have. No, I thought it was deeply Christian, in terms of the identity, but especially the vocation. And um, I thought it was, for me, it was more about vocational, less about soul,
Hmm.
right? Which I thought was kind of a beautiful surprise.
I was curious from your standpoint to ask you a question related to your retreat director's question. How would you define the difference between God and Jesus?
Hmm.
In part, this was sparked by we were reading, oh, gee, what was it? It was one of Paul's letters. And he talked about Jesus having existed from the beginning, which to me kind of scrambled my brain because I always thought of it as like, well, God tried this for a while and then it sort of didn't work. And then he changed his mind with Jesus. And so it just made
Hmm.
got confused by
My questions to you are a lot easier. Why are you asking me hard questions?
that.
Yeah, I mean it's a mystery, as we know. The Trinity is a mystery, and so anything we can say about it is going to kind of limp. But so there's God, right? Which is Trinity, as we believe in the Christian tradition. The way I like to express it, it's always going to get me in trouble because it's never complete. Is that the Trinity, in a sense, reflects the way that people experience God and have experienced God over the ages. So first, Father, Creator, right? I mean, that's the original way, and then God's revealed as Jesus, the Son, right? Who is God incarnate, who comes down and is with us. And to your point, is found in the ordinary, right? God making God's self. I don't want to say himself accessible and inviting. And then the Spirit is the primary way that we experience uh, God now. I mean, because Jesus isn't standing in front of us. I mean, you could say, in the different people, and we're not experiencing the Father directly. It's mainly the Spirit, but Yeah, and it's funny when I was writing, I have another book on Jesus, and when I was writing it, I kept I like you, I consulted lots of theologians for this book and for the Jesuit guidebook, and I kept talking about Jesus and God, and they were like, you can't say that; it has to be the Father.
Mm,
So, you know,
hmm,
so yeah, it's and as a spiritual director, people say it always makes me smile. I never laugh at what they say, but they'll say, I can't pray to God, so I pray to Jesus. I'm like, well, it's kind of the same thing, but it's kind of not the same thing. So
hmm.
I see it as different ways that God has of being revealed to us. And it's very much in terms of how people have experienced God, right? So yeah, that's my explanation of God.
All right. And related to that, then, would you say God is unchanging, or
Oh
is
man.
it more of the revelation? See, I'm asking all the big ones.
These are the hard questions.
Because,
Um,
like just to the earlier question, if Jesus was there as part of God,
yeah,
but only was revealed at a certain point,
yeah.
or is
Well,
it that God
I
in
know.
communication with us is changing as well?
All right. Well, the most honest answer to that question is I have no idea. I mean,
Okay.
we have no idea how God, and I don't mean that to be dismissive like the cup of coffee, but meaning it's hard to explain. In Christian theology, Christ is the Word. Christ exists with God. Okay, and so one in being, as we say in the creed. I think though, for me, sometimes those questions I just find they're important, right? But we can't get our minds around them, right? And in a sense, it's, as they say, God is a not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be pondered. That's kind of how I like to look at it. And the other questions that are that are difficult are like, how can Jesus be human and divine at the same time, right?
Right.
How can God be three persons? And
Right.
I tend not to. It's funny. I tend not to focus on those things as much because they are mysterious, right? And look, here's the other thing. I think the best thing is this. Maybe not best. Maybe this is helpful. So Jesus, I mean, as you know, and as you do, really taught in parables. So that's a parable that you made, right? It's a beautiful parable, and it expresses a larger truth, but not like a line, right? Like what does soul mean? It means this. No, it's like the story of the famous story of the composer who sits down. I don't know if it's Beethoven or Mozart, and he plays something, and the person says, "What does that mean?" And he sits down and plays it again and says, "That's what it means." Um, so Jesus is telling parables as you did with your beautiful movie, and I think that one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard was that Jesus, who's real, of course, and had a real life, and born, lived, and died, and rose from the dead, was a kind of parable that God was telling us. And so, we asked Jesus, the disciples asked Jesus, what's the reign of God? And Jesus tells us a story, right, about a seed, a mustard seed.
Hmm.
When in a sense we ask God, as we do all the time, who are you and what are you like? God tells us the story of Jesus.
Hmm.
And that's the Jesus as the parable of God, which I
Hmm.
love. So I just find that really, so anything you want to know about God, you look at Jesus, and so rather than, and not to dismiss your question, but rather than, kind of trying to understand these mysteries, to look at him, which is why he came. So we could appreciate and understand and love God. So I'm pretty big on Jesus, as you may know.
That's good to hear. The other thing that I admired about what you're doing is there has been a kind of especially in California, I don't know if this is everywhere, but it's almost like don't get into the Christian thing. Like that's forbidden territory. It makes everybody uncomfortable. And
You
it's
mean in your business or just in
just
general? Oh,
interpersonally,
yeah,
right? If
yeah, yeah,
you meet
right, right.
somebody like I'm scared to tell people sometimes because
I know,
typically they'll be like, "Oh, you're one of those weirdos,"
I know.
So the idea of just making this and explaining it on a deeper level, because I think most of the time those judgments are based off of very shallow understandings, um,
Yeah,
rather
well, and
than,
there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of reason why people think Christians are weirdos these
oh
days.
yeah,
And
Yeah.
it's understandable. But I think most people, a lot of people, they think that Christianity means you have to check your brain at the door. You're an
Right.
idiot. You're a moron. You're deluded, right? You think about, some, what do they call spaghetti monster in the sky, something like that. Like God is this kind of, mythical being.
Hmm.
But I think, I mean, I often think about these people. Have they met people like Dorothy Day, or, speaking of California, Cesar Chavez, or Pope
Hmm.
Francis, or
Hmm.
Thomas Aquinas? So I think it is based on some misunderstandings. How do you deal with that? I mean, is it hard for you in the film industry to be a
Yeah, I mean,
overt
I feel like
Christian?
in a way this film has sort of forced me to out myself a little bit more, and
Mm-hmm.
in a good way. I've been reluctant to do that, to speak more publicly, for fear of being judged, probably
Mm.
selfishly, but also just potentially, like, I think a lot of times people look at surface level words, and then they fill in the rest. And so, without having the ability to really explain myself, I don't know, sometimes that feels like maybe they're not the best thing to to get into.
I mean, like Christian, therefore Pete Docter's like a moron, or is that, or like
Yeah,
he's like,
or the fear of, like, oh, I'm not, now I don't like his movies anymore, or any of the
oh,
Pixar
that's
movies, or
interesting. Yeah,
by inference. But
that's
it does. I
interesting.
don't.
Do you ever think, I'm curious, and this you can answer or not answer. Do you ever think of doing a movie like that's like like sort of straight in your face Christian, like Jesus or the parables, or would you rather do it kind of from an oblique angle,
I prefer the oblique,
Yeah.
because, well, it's tricky to tell stories, and even this one, I feel like we nearly stepped on it a couple times of being a little too didactic, or lectury at people, and
Like where?
uh, we we ended up backing off on the places I'm thinking of. But anytime you try to spell it out too
Yeah.
clearly for
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
people, like, they don't go to movies to take medicine. They
Right. Right.
want to
No,
go.
right. It's not a lecture. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So you were saying that you prefer the oblique way, like a
I do.
parable. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I feel as though if I were to tell a story that's straight up, well, the other thing that and this is me, uh, I sometimes hesitate to call myself a Christian, because I feel like, again, back to the earning thing. I don't know that I've deserved that yet. I don't know that I understand things deep enough,
Well, who
you
does,
know.
right?
I would be very nervous. So, oh no, I'm speaking in some
Oh, I
way
see.
for
Hmm.
the larger institution.
No, I think it's more. I mean, I think the parable, which is obviously what you created, I think it's more effective because who's gonna? I mean, who's gonna go to a movie that's like kind of the didactic, exposition of the Gospels? People,
Right.
it's sort of
Right.
relegated
Sit
to.
down, people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Let me tell you something.
Yeah.
Um, well, thanks for your time. Anything else you want to talk about, or?
Oh, that's great. Thank you for taking the extra time.
And our thanks as well to Pete Docter and Pixar for making movies like Soul and for making the time to talk to us. And of course, thanks to Father Jim Martin. Yes, The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything is a great book, but he also has a new one just out called Learning to Pray, a guide for everyone. From a guide to almost everything to a guide for everyone. He's getting ambitious. Can't wait to see Pete Docter's animated version of that one. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for your support. I'm David Gibson for the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University. See you again soon.